Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen Coates. There's nothing we like better at the Bureau of Lost Culture than a story of lost culture and rare audio. Mix it in with a bit of jazz. Some stories about Soho and the East End of London, and you've got the perfect episode for us. And today it's courtesy of my guest, ALAN DEIN. He's returning to the Bureau of Lost Culture. Last time he was here to talk about the self-made record, the records that were made in kiosks and other places by members of the public to record their own voices and songs in the 1930s and 40s. ALAN is an award-winning broadcaster, producer for the BBC, oral historian, he's a researcher in Jewish cultural history, and he's a bit of an expert in London too. All these things mixed up in the recent album that he released, Music is the Most Beautiful Language in the World, Yiddisher Jazz in London's East End in the 1920s to 1950s. We're going to hear music from that, and we're going to hear stories about that culture. And about gangsters in Soho, poverty and glamour in pre-war London, and all sorts of other stuff. So I'm very pleased to welcome him back. Hello, ALAN.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Well, having you back, actually. So, ALAN, last time you were here, we were talking about one of your obsessions, one of my obsessions too, recently, the self-made record.
Indeed.
The voice record. Now, ALAN, you are, of course, an oral historian, radio broadcaster, but that's just the sort of surface of it. Why don't you tell us, why don't we start off by you telling us, who is ALAN DEIN?
Well, that is an intriguing question because I would like to know myself. But oral history is something that's been my working life and something I've been passionate about for many, many years. I also call myself a social historian because I'm fascinated in lots of different elements of social culture and social history.
Just to back up the truck a little bit, I knew you'd be too modest actually to mention all this stuff because you've made many, many documentaries. BBC,
yeah,
got some major radio awards. Pre-Italia, pre-Europe, Sony Radio Awards, the US Third Coast. You're a member of the Oral History Society, all that sort of stuff. But the things, I mean, we're going to cycle back to this most recent project, but also you've made a lot of London work as well, haven't you? You've made a lot of work around where you live. You've got your book about Golders Green's coming out. You've made programs about King's Cross, Caledonian Road, etc. And I think for anybody who doesn't know, I mean, an oral historian is somebody who collects those histories, as you mentioned there, and it's even with your current, Radio 4 program, Don't Log Off, which is where you're collecting stories from around the world, aren't you? So that, I mean, in a way, you are a kind of story catcher, aren't you? You collect and catch other people's stories.
Yeah, it's a good way of putting it. I suppose I like to think that I'm a conduit for people to tell their stories. I'm a prompter. Obviously, I was very inspired by the work of people like Studs Terkel, the great American historian, oral historian. I totally admire what he did, but I don't see myself as a Studs because Studs was a personality in his own right. He was a character.
Right, and you, I think, always been a bit invisible.
Yeah, because I don't really feel it's about me.
Right. How did you feel when I've got you on the other side of the microphone? I'm giving you a light grilling.
Yeah, as you can hear, Stephen, I do feel less comfortable than when I'm prompting other people. I'm very happy to talk about things I do, and I'm very touched that people are interested, and I really appreciate it. But I do think that my work is very much about trying to find a way to get, as you say, to get people to tell their stories. And with Don't Log Off, it is very international, and obviously we're using the lingua franca of the world, which is English. So people around the world, whether they're in South America or Southeast Asia, are talking to me in almost perfect English. It's incredible.
It is amazing, actually, the incredible English that people have got. And the interesting thing about Don't Log Off, I mean, I suppose in a way the interesting thing about radio for me at the moment, including this program, is that radio, despite the growth of other media, it's still the most powerful one for telling stories, isn't it? I mean, in your program, I listen to your program, and it's like you're there sometimes with the people, aren't you? You're actually in their world, and that's the magic of radio. And that, I think, in a way, the 20th century, when radio sort of emerged, that was what was magic about it, wasn't it? That connecting stories across the continents, across the world, across time.
I completely agree with you, and I think what a lot of it is down to the fact that the potency of the voice, and the voice as being some kind of window or a portal to the soul, and we feel that more and more as we listen, particularly in the kind of research you've been doing in the former Soviet Union. Most of history falls through the cracks of history. So basically, what happens is that most of the stuff that we hear and read about, unfortunately, still to this day, is the stuff that is formally printed in the newspapers.
Well, the story that we're going to be talking about today, which is centres around this wonderful album of Yiddish London music that you've put out. I mean, that combines a lot of your interest, doesn't it? But I mean, how did you come to it? What's your sort of background that brought you to that?
Coming from a background that I would call sort of Jewish background, but that kind of that movement of the Jewish community out of the East London through into the suburbs. So I grew up in Hendon in northwest London and lived this sort of double life, a life where a lot of the family and the older members of the family would be, some of them would be very nostalgic about the world of East London particularly, and the memories of growing up there in the interwar years and those kind of lives of a very active, bustling community. And I've always been intrigued by those stories, particularly in East London, but also here where we're speaking now in Soho, in the West End, because obviously there was a very deep-seated Jewish culture in the West End as well, which goes back to the 1700s. And my background was through working in a museum which was called the Museum of the Jewish East End. And the Museum of the Jewish East End was a fledgling museum. It was right in the early days of sort of community social history. And our project was to do oral histories and document and collect people's memories and artefacts relating to life in London, and particularly the East End of London. And one of the projects that I've been doing the last couple of years, which is trying to source the kind of stories of Jewish music in England, but not the kind of high Jewish music, that is the cantoral music or the sort of high synagogue music of choirs. I was more interested in that popular music, the dance music, the bands that performed week in, week out, played the weddings, played the big functions and the charity events, but also musicians that would start from humble origins in the East End of London and become household names. You know, the likes of Ambrose and Lou Stone and Joe Loss and Harry Roy. These musicians that brought so much to British culture, but also were so locked in a world of their childhoods growing up in East London, and also that kind of emergence of a idiom which we now call jazz or big bands. But going back to what you're saying about the music itself, you know, the kind of link between, you know, the East End, and particularly the kind of the work I've been doing trying to kind of rediscover a lot of the music that did fall through the cracks of history, particularly records that were produced by dance bands who were desperately trying to move up the ladder and didn't want to record the kind of music that their grandparents would be listening to, or the kind of music that would play at Jewish functions. But sometimes they did, and those recordings are incredibly scarce. And, you know, so I've been managing to sort of trace those records.
Right. And the LP that you brought out last year, Alan, Music is the Most Beautiful Language in the World. So some of the actual artists, as they were, Lou Stone, Ambrose, they're quite famous, aren't they? But actually the tracks themselves are quite rare. And, you know,
that's exactly
why don't we hear the Ambrose track, which is called A Selection of Hebrew Dances, and you can tell us a little bit about it. So that was 1933, Alan, quite early then actually, wasn't it? And still sounding, as you said, it's difficult to kind of keep still. Your foot's immediately tapping, you're sort of moving around to it. It's pretty groovy, isn't it?
It is, and you can get, it's a sense of, it's fusion, isn't it? It's Hebrew music with dance music. Ambrose put out a record of the selection of Hebrew dances, parts 1 and parts 2. Part 1 is "On the Music is the most beautiful language in the world." By the way, that was a slogan of a record shop in Brick Lane in the 1920s. It was a time when people were starting to have disposable income and buy gramophone players. It was also the time when people were starting to get rid of their old pianos in the front room,
of course,
and put up the gramophone player. But the gramophone player became such a phenomenon. And there was a record shop called Levy's in Whitechapel High Road. And the great thing about Levy's is not only did it sell the popular music of the day, like music hall artists and so forth, but they got these red-hot jazz imports from America. And a lot of the great musicians, the likes of the Ambroses and the Lou Stones and the young Joe Losses, would buy their records there because they wanted to hear this kind of this new jazz idiom that was coming out, the foxtrots, the charlestons, these incredible tunes, which of course weren't being played on the radio in the 1920s.
Well, that's right, of course. I mean, the BBC was notoriously shy about playing anything like that, wasn't they?
So that the music wasn't played. The BBC did catch up eventually, and all these musicians I've just mentioned became household names through the BBC, as the BBC did pick up on that music in the 1930s. But certainly in the first 10 years of its life, from the early 20s through to the early 30s, they didn't really touch it at all. They kind of shied away from popular culture. It was a little bit too rough and ready. It was also a little bit too new. They didn't really understand it.
Yeah, you see, the interesting thing for me in this, in terms of this program, the Bureau of Lost Culture, is, a large part of it is about counterculture. And of course, when we think about counterculture, we normally think about 1950s, the Beats, the hippies, maybe the 70s, and then maybe the 80s and the 90s, the free festival scene and raves and stuff. But of course, the stuff that you're talking about, in fact, is countercultural, wasn't it? It was effectively Jewish counterculture from that time. I mean, it wasn't being played by the big cultural institution, which is the BBC, and it was a kind of underground thing.
I think it most probably was. You're right, and certainly listening to this Ambrose track, what you're hearing is a mix of the kind of prevalent dance music of the day with a sort of Jewish folk idiom thrown into it, and it's the sort of music you would only hear if you did walk into a wedding in London in the 1920s and 30s. You would not have heard it anywhere else. So the fact that this was recorded at all and was made available, but of course, like a lot of these recordings, they disappeared because it was one of hundreds of records that Ambrose produced. Ambrose, I don't actually know. The discography, Ambrose's discography is telephone books.
Yeah, it's massive. Yeah.
They were putting out so many records. It was so popular, and also music was really disposable. It came out, and then there was another track and another track and another track. It didn't stand still.
It's gone back to being like that through Spotify, I think, etc. But what was it like? What did it feel like actually digging up these rare gems?
Just that kind of thrill of finding them as well, because they had slipped out of consciousness, and so the only way to find them, and there wasn't an obvious discography, so it really was a matter of just hunting wild, just really digging through the British Library, digging through discs that have been donated to the Jewish Museum, and also some discs that were found in charity shops in places like Golders Green, where that generation of people had passed on but left these discs.
Amazing stuff.
And 78s in charity shops don't last long. Not so much in the sense that people are going to buy them, but the fact they get broken.
Sure, I mean, they don't survive. I'm going to go straight on to this next track because people might recognise this tune. Not this version of it, but certainly the actual song itself.
But to accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, latch on to the affirmative, don't mess with Mr. In-Between. But to spread joy up to the maximum, bring gloom down to the minimum, have faith or pandemonium, liable to walk up on the scene to illustrate my positive. Eliminate the negative. Latch on to the affirmative. Don't mess with Mr. In-Between. No, don't mess with Mr. In-Between.
You've got Ambrose working with the singer Rita Marlowe. Rita was one of Ambrose's female singers. There was always a sort of, most big bands had the woman singer who would come on for certain numbers. And Rita was interesting because, not well known today, Rita was an East End girl from Stepney. Her father was a choir master at a local synagogue in Stepney, and she she was that generation who broke away from a very sort of formal upbringing to sort of mix with the jazz boys and go into that world of the dance band and perform. And she performed with Ambrose and a number of the big bands until after the war, where she pretty much dedicated the rest of her singing life to just singing in Yiddish. And why I felt it was important to kind of listen to Ambrose and Rita Marlowe together on this track is that it's so distant in a way from that Jewish world that they inhabited in the East End, and so different from the Hebrew dance selection of Hebrew dances and some of the tracks that Rita was going to be singing later when she brought out a lot of records, mostly on the Oriole label, specifically Yiddish songs. And what I find intriguing is here we have a very American tune.
Yeah, totally. And an American vibe on that tune as well, isn't it? I mean,
it's and in a way, it's the vibe of what was happening at the time. You can imagine this when this came out in 1944, 45. All those American soldiers here, based in the West End, going out, going to the clubs, bands like Ambrose and many other dance bands performing, and you could just imagine the sort of the halls filled with sort of cigarette fumes and the American servicemen,
totally,
hanging out, checking out the women,
and
listening
particularly
to the
in this area, you imagine, don't you? I mean, it's I know around the corner, clubs like the Flamingo. You mentioned earlier about the kind of Jewish connections in Soho, and so the record store that you mentioned, Levi's, was in the East End. A lot of these musicians were East End Jewish musicians, but what was going on here then? I mean, you mentioned that there's a strong Jewish community here.
There was a strong community here that had started in the 1700s, and the community had grown substantially until the big wave really kind of transformed, particularly areas like Berwick Street, which became predominantly a Jewish market. So by the 1930s, after the big wave of the Jewish immigration in the late 19th century, you're looking at about 75% of the market as Jewish stallholders. Lots of the shops were clothing related. So the Jewish community, by the time they'd arrived in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, not only in East London but also in the West End, had focused predominantly on certain trades. And one of the trades that was really kind of took up most people's kind of working life was the tailoring trade, because it was actually quite an easy job to get into. Often they had Jewish employers. Often you didn't actually you didn't have to speak English. A lot of jobs weren't available. There was there was a kind of bar on a number of jobs. So in certain areas, if you were Jewish, you wouldn't be able to get a job. I think as far as the music was concerned, and I think that all the generations from that earlier generation, like Ambrose and Lou Stone, to people like Ronnie Scott and Cy Laurie, the great sort of Jewish-born jazzers of the 1950s and onwards, a lot of that generation were East End boys moving to the West End. Everything was up west. Your ambition was to go west. And if you were a young musician, you would head off to places like Archer Street, just around the corner from where we're speaking, near the theatres, the back of the theatres, where the musicians would just stand around, talking about music, talking about their favourite musicians, talking about different styles of drum playing or trumpet playing, saxophone playing, whatever, and it would just be hanging out, talking about music, but also trying to find a gig, trying to find a band, getting a band together. And so it was very much, so you had the Tin Pan Alley scene, Denmark Street, you had Archer Street, and you had a kind of sense of, and also the other thing, which is very important, you had Piccadilly. Nowadays, it's funny about London. If you think about London over the last 50 years even, parts of London become very fashionable and then die out. So you had someone like King's Road. Back in the 60s and 70s, everyone used to talk about King's Road. Who cares about King's Road now?
Yeah, for sure.
It's
been rinsed by sort of Evian, hasn't it? And it's of no interest really.
No interest. And it's the same with Mayfair.
Spending money.
Mayfair, Piccadilly. Piccadilly back in the 20s and 30s had so many hotels, so many restaurants that all had dance bands performing.
So for these East End kids, a lot of them from poor backgrounds, their ambition was to get up west. They might learn their trade, whether it be rag trade or as a musician in the East, playing with their mates first of all, and then sort of working their way up. But the big ambition was to get into, to be, say, playing with Ambrose in one of the big hotels or one of the big dance halls at West.
Without doubt. And significantly, not only could you ply your trade and you could be working, you could work every night, also you'd be earning a lot of money.
Right.
The bands that performed in these big hotels, to the huge crowds that would queue up on a Sunday to dance to the live music, these bands were very handsomely paid. And if you had, if you as a band had a regular stints at these hotels and restaurants, you would really be doing very well. And also as well as travelling, so because if you were known as playing in these hotels in Mayfair, you would also be travelling to the big hotels up and down the country and abroad.
So it could be quite a glamorous lifestyle.
It was a very glamorous lifestyle. It was also a lifestyle that was in a way a conflict for a lot of the musicians, because it was a very different world to their childhoods and different world to their parents. And so it was a form of anglicisation in a sense. They were kind of adopting another lifestyle, but at the same time, and particularly why I'm so intrigued about this music is their roots, and they, however much you live your life, you can't escape those roots, and you can't deny that those roots had a very significant role to play in the kind of musician you were. So someone like Ambrose, he started to play the violin because his dad and heard a man playing the violin outside his house in the Commercial Road, and pulled the guy in and said, "Can you teach my son how to play the violin?" And and just to be able to kind of to at such a young age to be able to have those skills about to play, but also the fact is that they were playing in something like Ambrose. He was playing in silent cinemas, playing the violin in to silent films, to accompany the films. He was playing in small clubs. He was building his skills. And they were all doing that. Max Bacon, the drummer, by the 1930s became most probably one of the most well-known drummers in Britain. Wrote the first book on drum playing for Premier Drums. On jazz drumming, so very important people. But what I do find so fascinating is that someone like Louis Steinberg of Bethnal Green becomes Lou Stone.
Right, so that's Lou Stone here. So I want to play this track because Lou Stone, of course, he's another person who became very famous.
Absolutely.
In that world, but I'd never heard of this track before. So let's have a quick listen to this. It's Abrivella de Mama.
Abrivella de Mama, I don't need zusammen, ich schreib geschwind, liebes Kind, schenke dir nach Hause, die Mami wird ein Brief lesen, und sie wird genesen, heilt die Schmerzen bitte, quicke dir nach Hause.
You said it's a letter to Mama. Lou Stone, you mentioned before then, Alan, so he anglicised his name. Right?
He did.
And was that necessary? Was that part of, you're saying about, how difficult it was for them to get on in the world, maybe because they were Jewish, so the sort of certain bars, the bar was higher or certain doors were closed. Was that a necessary part of it, that you had to play the game by sounding like you were British or even American? I think Loose Stone sounds a bit American, doesn't it?
It does, and I think that if you look at most people in show business, the names that they adopted as their showbiz name was not their real name. So that across the board, not only specifically Jewish people, but certainly a lot of Jewish people just decided to remove the Jewishness from their name. So hence Louis Steinberg becomes Lou Stone, Harry Littman becomes Harry Roy. And sort of it's a sense of it is a sense of that kind of Americanization, Anglicization, but it's also a sense of in a way it's wiping the slate clean. It's saying, this is new, I'm fresh. It's not about yesterday, it's not about the past, it's about who I'm going to make myself in the future. And I think that what was happening amongst particularly a lot of the Jewish musicians at that time, they were at a crest of a wave. They were at a point where they were making their own history. They were at a point where music was so fresh and so original that they were pathfinders. And I think that in a way, to be like that, you wanted to sort of remove the shackles of history, remove the shackles of the past, and so in a way, that's why I find this music so interesting, because in some senses they still got it, it's still there, but nevertheless they want to be Harry Roy or Lou Stone, and as you say, a lot of people didn't know they were Jewish. And I think that most probably that did help. It was also, there was a prevalent anti-Semitism throughout this period. Obviously, a lot of the music we're talking about from the 1930s, it coincides with the rise of the British Union, the fascists and so forth, and obviously fascism throughout Europe. So we are talking about a backdrop of anti-Semitism here, and obviously a backdrop of anti-Semitism which brought them to this country in the first place. Parents fleeing Eastern Europe. Lots
of refugees, right?
Exactly.
Before the war as well as after the war.
Exactly. Right? So Ambrose was born in Poland. So he actually was not even born here. He came over as a child from Poland.
I think also the bringing with them as well, because it's a very important part of jazz, full stop, is that kind of Yiddish influence as well, isn't it?
Totally.
I mean, you've got gypsy music, you've got black blues, you've got honky tonk and ragtime, and of course Yiddish music, all blending together to what became swing, right?
It's totally true, and I think the music that people use as this catch-all term as klezmer is, as you say, is a form of gypsy music, is a music of the wanderer, and Jews have been wanderers for centuries. They've moved from place to place, and the culture has moved with them, and the music has moved with them, and it's adapted to different places where they've been. So whether they had a stop off in Warsaw, or whether they had a stop off in Russia, they would adopt some of the culture from where they were, and then they would take it with them again. And so they were always sort of collecting. They were sorts of collectors in a way of all the different kinds of music that they were kind of embracing on their journey. And I think that what happens here in the 1930s is you get this ultimate fusion between the music of the time, which is obviously predominantly dance band music, and of course in the kind of tracks that I'm sort of been intrigued about, the fact that it doesn't go away.
And that's very true in this next one. This is Max Bacon. You mentioned him earlier, so he was a drummer, right? Okay, so let's have a listen to this.
There's a certain fellow what everybody knows. He is such a funny fellow. When he went to school, he must have specialized to become a clever seller. If you ever happen to be near, why, it's 10 to 1, he'll whisper in your ear. Oh, if you want a suit that's nifty, don't pay 60 bob or 50. I can get it for you wholesale. If you're thinking about marriage, don't you buy a baby's carriage. I can get it for you wholesale. I can get you anything you want if you'll agree, and I'll guarantee that you'll almost buy it free. Say, if you need an operation, Dr. Brad is my relation. I can get it for you wholesale. Yes, anything you want from cornflakes to corsets, I can get it for you at tradesmen's prices. Why, there's a friend of mine who goes into Holy Padlock not so long ago lately. So when I hear he's getting married, I gets for him a specially cheap ring in a second-hand license. And I fixes up the furniture for the house, all brand new antiques. Then I don't see him for maybe a year. And he comes back and he says, Max, he says, my wife is suspecting a blessed event. Well, I'll be blessed, I says, good luck to you. Now you leave it to me, I can get for you everything wholesale. So I fixes up with him the Eternity Home.
Genius. So, and I think Alan, that wasn't on the record, was it?
No, I thought
you've been saving that up.
I would save that one especially for you, Stephen, because it's quite nice to play tracks that aren't available that accessible. And the one on the record is Beigels, which is most probably one of the great tunes about food of all time, and particularly classic Jewish East End food, Beigels, not bagels. And Max Bacon's had a series of records out. He was a drummer with Ambrose by day, but also what he would do is put out his own tracks, usually adopting what he called Yinglish, which is a sort of Middle European. So he sounds like he comes from Eastern Europe, and he obviously is Jewish.
He was hamming it up there a bit,
and
wasn't he?
Obviously a ham. He became an actor.
Right.
He pretty much gave up music by the 1950s and 60s and went into performing. And you'd see, you see old episodes of things like Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and stuff. He appears in those. He appears in quite a lot of classic British films.
I mean, the amazing thing about that for me as well is that I know this is leaping forward quite a bit, but you can hear in a song like that, you can hear what Lionel Bart was doing later, can't you?
Well, that's a really
good
point.
Of course, Lionel Bart, East End Jewish boy, wasn't he? But,
totally.
And who couldn't play an instrument, but would sing all his songs to somebody who could write music down, and he would write them down for him. But he had that kind of intonation and the melodies and the lyric, actually, in a funny way. The way of that skittery way of actually delivering it is.
Yeah, it's actually it's a really good point, because I think that what happens is that Bart is a generation after Max Bacon, but certainly both Bart and Bacon were influenced by music hall, and music hall was something that was on your doorstep when you were growing up in East London.
So there were many music halls, right?
All over the place. And of course that kind of patter, the kind of using sort of street language, Cockney, using this sort of slang, and of course imitating the way people talk in the street. And of course a lot of the generation of the kind of voices that Max Bacon puts on are the sounds of how your uncle sounded.
Right.
When I was a youngster and going to going to functions.
So do you think that record was made for the Jewish community in a way? I mean,
it's a speciality record.
Right.
It was predominantly made for the Jewish community. Obviously, a wider community if you get the gags, because a lot of those Jewish gags were being performed in musical. There was from the late 19th century. There was a kind of Jewish comedians who would do stand-up comedians. It's totally un-PC today and be very uncomfortable watching it. I call it sort of Shylocks and slapstick. So they would dress a little bit like a Shylock and do slapstick, and it's mocking. It's kind of mocking the sort of Jewish Eastern European kind of look and that sort of ghetto character, but at the same time, kind of playfully, kind of acknowledging the fact that Jews are more likely to be businessmen, be working in the markets. Here, Max Bacon says, "I can get it for you wholesale,"
right?
Which is a classic line.
So the interesting thing of that, of course, is that it is sort of okay if you're Jewish making those jokes, in a way that it's okay to say certain things about black people if you're black, but it's certainly not okay to say them if you're white, right? So it was a kind of in-joke for the community, and they sort of saw the irony of it at the same time, right?
They definitely got it, and I think that they would enjoy just listening to stuff that is about the world they inhabited,
right?
So they can connect with it, and identify with it. A younger generation listening to that kind of stuff would be most probably a little bit more uncomfortable
Sure.
because they feel it objectifies them and it stereotypes and so forth and so forth. And obviously that's a complicated one. But certainly Max Bacon came from that. And, as you say with Lionel Bart, he drew on a lot of that imagery and the sounds that he heard on the street and the sounds that he would have listened to from the kind of the racket coming out of pubs of sing-songs and all of that stuff he was picking up on as he was songwriting. And then obviously, as you say, he had a very, very kind of he had a very powerful ear, an ear which was able to kind of regurgitate this kind of stuff into very kind of palatable pop songs and theatrical songs.
Yeah,
and,
totally. Now, this next song is a bit wider, isn't it? The sort of appeal, the subject matter is a bit wider. I think most of us can recognise this. It's London on a Rainy Night.
It rained one night in London, and I never shall forget, for incidentally that's the night we met. And when it rains in London, you can bet it really rains. For all I know, it may be raining yet. She was a wee little maid in distress, with not a cab or omnibus in view. So I played the part of the gent, and I said, my umbrella's made for two. Well, she took my arm so gently, and I walked her to her door. I kissed her and she sort of held me tight. So we're going to be married, and I'm more than thankful for London on a rainy night.
But there's something very evocative about these tunes, and the reason why I thought it would be quite nice to listen to this is that, here we have Harry Roy from the same sort of background and coming from the backgrounds that we're talking about with a lot of these musicians. And it really is the kind of the focus of his path was to perform this kind of jazz music. And he became a very accomplished player, and incredibly well known. Little kids would have a Harry Roy cigarette card that the dad would smoke the fags and kind of give them the cards, and it was very much a sense of Harry Roy was a sort of a well-known figure, but obviously Harry Roy was Harry Lipman of Shoreditch,
right?
And of course, like a lot of these musicians, aspired to the kind of music that we were listening to, didn't record any what I would call sort of Yiddisher jazz. There's nothing that I know of. He would have played it certainly when he would have played functions and so forth. A lot of these musicians would play charity functions.
Right, so he would have grown up playing that stuff, as it were.
Definitely.
And then moved into this more kind of like swish sort of sound.
Yeah, and would most probably have certainly never recorded the kind of tracks we listened to earlier, the kind of Ambrose or even Loose Stone's A Letter to My Mother or Bravada the Mama. Wouldn't have recorded those kind of tracks, but definitely a very integral part of the British dance band scene, and someone who was phenomenally respected and played well into the sort of 1950s. And the important thing about the dance bands is that you did dance to them. It's not like when I was going to gigs in the 70s and 80s where you just stand and watch the band, or you might pogo or whatever, but there wasn't a sense of actually dancing with a partner.
You were there to dance, weren't you? They were dance bands, that was it. You didn't stand and watch, you danced. Right?
And people learnt how to dance. At 17, most people want to learn how to drive a car. At 17, you went straight to your dance band teacher, and there was a dance band teacher at the end of your road.
Right, I didn't know that. So actually, everybody actually was given some lessons.
Oh,
with
yes.
it, in the way that you give a driving lesson now.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah, the ear of the dance band instructor was, you go through the old telephone directories, and it's amazing to see how many people taught dance, because that was you needed to.
That was how you graduated
Exactly.
in some way from being a kind of youth to being a kind of young woman or a young man. Alan, let's have a listen to this one. This is Wilhelmina, and it's Johnny Franks and his kosher ragtimers.
Wilhelmina, she's the sweetest little girl in Copenhagen. In Copenhagen, Wilhelmina, she drives all the fellas with sugar in Copenhagen. In Copenhagen. And the roses from her cheek, and the chutzpah when she speaks, and the way her kisses taste, kinda Hamish like Mam Bubba's Danish pastry. Wilhelmina, does the fur shop go along with all of your nodding in Copenhagen? Wilhelmina, if your father will make the wedding, I'll buy a toboggan in Copenhagen. All the other girls.
You're slipping into cabaret there, right? It's wonderful.
It's definitely comedy, definitely playful, almost sort of taking the mickey out of a sort of an American standard, a song from a movie, 1940s, 1947, Johnny Franks. And
Who was Johnny
kosher-
Franks?
Johnny Franks was a butcher's boy. His family ran butcher shops in Stamford Hill in East London, and violinist. And by the time after the war, he learnt his trade as a youngster in the Ensa, kind of playing various different gigs to the forces. And so by the time the war ends, he's semi-professional already. And he was a West End figure as well. He would be hovering around Archer Street and so forth, looking for gigs, finding bands, forming different kinds of bands. And Franks puts out a whole load of records on a speciality label called Planet, which was based in Stamford Hill, and they put out Jewish tracks. So it was specifically for the Jewish audience. As you say, a bit of cabaret, a lot of comedy, lots of playful, lots of Yiddish words. Again, very influenced by America and people like Nicky Katz, the American comedian. And they were mostly kind of parodies of famous songs of the day, really stretching his different talents. He was a violinist, but he was also a jazz musician. And throughout his career, he performed in so many different bands. And he was also well known on what they called the Yiddisher Borscht Belt, where people would go on their holidays. Jewish people would go. And here in England, it was predominantly in Brighton and Bournemouth. So there would be hotels where Jewish families would go, and there would be bands like Johnny Franks, and performing to these audiences and playing those kind of songs. When I was researching music is the most beautiful language in the world, I met up with Johnny Franks' daughter, and she gave me a typewritten manuscript of Johnny's autobiography, which is called "If You Don't Ask, You Don't Get," and it's and I must read you a section from, because it's obviously here in the West End. It's about a club called the Nut House, and it's set in 1946. News had spread about a new club called the Nut House, so I wanted to get my band in residence there. The club was located in the basement of a dress shop at the bottom end of Regent Street, Piccadilly. When I knocked on the door, an eye opened behind the peephole. "Yes," the eye said. "I've come about my band," I said. "Can I come in?" After a series of bolts were unlocked, the door opened to reveal Al Burnett, the club owner. "Would you be interested in my 7-piece band?" He took a minute to answer. "All right, come for an audition, Monday at 11. The following Monday, my band rehearsed at Mac's rehearsal rooms, doing 3 arrangements over a couple of hours. Then we hot-footed it to the Nut House Club for 11. Once inside the club, we could see the Prohibition-style decor which Burnett had designed, quite obviously with customer anonymity in mind. The lighting was dim, just enough light for the bands to read their sheet music. The whole decor of the place was the 1930s gangster style, with red check tablecloths, celebrity pictures on the wall, Jerry Lewis, Dean Martin, Danny Kaye, and cages behind the bar that held the clients' personal bottles of booze. Burnett hired us to work from 9:30 until 3 a.m. every day for £14 a week and £20 for me because I was the band leader. I was delighted to accept it. After World War II, musicians were plentiful, so I was glad to get some work. I had a good rhythm section, a tenor sax, electric guitar, and I pioneered the electric violin, a new sound with a Benny Goodman septet style combination of swing string voice arrangements. Those days at the Nut House were wonderful. I met some wonderful stars: Django Reinhardt, Stefan Grappelli, Jack Hilton, Harry Roy, Carol Gibbons, and so many besides. But the immense success of the club was ruined by the greed of the London mafia. Their local gangs demanded protection money from all the clubs and bars in the West End. Jack Spot was the leader of the West End, and he had 200 men at his beck and call. One night I was playing at the Nut House. Spot's rival gangster, Albert Dimes from the Clerkenwell district, came to the club with his entourage. They sat opposite the band to make themselves seen. They wanted to let Burnett know that Dimes could protect the club for less money than Spot. Burnett panicked and telephoned Spot to tell him that Dimes' mob was in. Spot came down with his henchmen and sat at the front of the club. I was facing Dimes and knew a fight was about to kick off. I told Manny, our drummer, to get under the piano. Spot's top man walked across to the front and stuck a burning cigarette in Dimes' face. The battle commenced. There was mayhem as furniture smashed and bottles went flying. The next day there was a notice on the door: "This establishment is closed." So that was it.
Oh man, terrific.
I dubbed myself down and found another job.
Yeah, what a picture as well.
It's a
of that
totally,
time,
it's fabulous because you've got it all. You've got a sense of the kind of clubs that existed at that point. Obviously, that whole background of gangsters, Soho. Obviously, it's part of Soho folklore. But it was real, and it was tough and rough, and obviously for the musicians, they were always had to be very careful because things could kick off.
And they did. I mean, that's it. He walked over and stubbed a cigarette on his face. I mean, that's going to kick off. Alan, we're going to move on. So we've got Sam. Let's have this one. Sam Goldberg and Ellen Vinograd.
Okay.
Kan men lycklig sein.
Die Luft ist frei, für jeden gleich. Die Sonne sie scheint für jeden einen Orm oder Ei. A bissl frei, a bissl lachen, a Mund mit Freien, a Schnäpsel machen, a wie gesund, kann man glücklich sein. Einer sich das Schieres, einer sich Gewirres, einer meint die ganze Welt. Einer meint das ganze Glück, hängt darauf mit Geld. Sollen alle siechen, sollen alle kriegen, nur ich tracht bei mir. Ihr darf das auf Kapores, weil das Glück steht bei mein Tier.
She's singing in Yiddish there, right?
This is Yiddish, and that's Ellen Vinograd, and she's singing with Sam Goldberg. The reason that it's important to kind of hear stuff like that is that this is a typical Yiddish song, popular song written for Yiddish theatre that was released on record, but it was also part of a revival of Yiddish that was happening after the war. What was happening is, as through the process of Anglicisation, because young Jewish kids, when they went to school, Jewish schools, they didn't speak Yiddish. They couldn't, went to Jews' free school in East London. Yiddish was not spoken in the school. They were told to speak English. Yiddish was considered an old language. It was a language from the old world. With the devastation of the Yiddish-speaking community during the Second World War and the Holocaust, it meant that there was definitely already a kind of nostalgia, a realization that you needed to keep the language alive. But there was a bit of a battle within the Jewish community. There was two tribes. There was those who said we move on. That was the past. we're about the here and now. But there was another saying that this is our language. This is our cultural language. It is a language of the wandering Jew who's ended up in Eastern Europe and who's fused a bit of German, a bit of Russian, a bit of Slavic languages into this kind of this hodgepodge called Yiddish, which is a language that obviously has evolved to this day and is very much part of American and English speak. You know, when we talk about schlapping somewhere and so forth. You know, we all know what we mean. You know what people mean. So it's become part of the lexicon. But certainly this song and the next song by Baker and Willie Stephanie was a well-known Yiddish performer who actually opened a Yiddish club in Soho in the 1940s and 50s. And the whole idea of the Yiddish club was to get young people into the club to speak Yiddish. Because it was this idea that if we didn't keep it going, it would disappear.
Right, so that's a way to save the language then, to actually have a specific venue for young people, play music, do stuff that they're going to enjoy doing and get them to speak
exactly. Yiddish. So if when we hear a little bit of Oi the System, which is Baker and Willie were a novelty act. They were a Yiddish novelty act, which was very popular, say, in America, less so here, certainly on record. And this is one of the very rare surviving records of Baker and Willie, very rare indeed. But what you do here is this sense of pinpointing not only the fact that they're using Yiddish language, but they're also playing up the kind of fascination with gambling that the Jewish community had. It was spieling.
All of us enjoy the pleasure of a hobby in our leisure. Poker for the over 40s. Young folk may have other sporties. Many people like to ramble. Through a race course for a gamble. Finding winners is the puzzle. All you need is lots of muzzle. Systemites will always have a try. The motto is to win or lose.
It's a bit like listening to Monty Python or something, right? I mean, it's like it's quite complex, right, as well.
It is, and it's put out on a small independent label in a tiny studio, and lots of resourcefulness there, and totally, it's got all the playfulness of that kind of comedy, almost kind of goon-like, in that sense, and it's almost like radio comedy, but Jewish style, Anglo-Jewish style. But it's an interesting snapshot of the kind of humour that was very popular at that time, and the fact that they were using Yiddish, and also in jokes about the Jewish obsession with gambling, playing cards till the late nights, through the night, going to horse racing, greyhound racing, and a lot of Jewish writers would write novels. People like Alexander Barron and so forth wrote books about that kind of world. So I think it's very important, and then I think that I think what's so interesting about that track, the fact that it was ever recorded at all. Yeah. How many people would have bought that record? Yeah. Hundreds, most probably.
But that, of course, these days, hundreds of people buying an actual vinyl record is quite respectable. As I said, we've come full circle. So we're moving towards the end, Alan, and we're moving through time, and I suppose we're going to finish off with this Yiddisher samba. But so the record that you put out is very much a kind of a window in time, a snapshot in time.
Yes.
And do you feel that, like, after that, there carried on being a kind of specifically, Yiddish or Yiddish jazz, or Jewish sound in London, or did it through the fact that the young kids are coming up to the West End, they're playing the dance bands, they're playing internationally, they're going out into the world, that it kind of actually then goes out into the world? Because of course there's many famous Jewish songwriting, particularly duos, right? Thousands of them, Baccarat David, Sam Garfunkel. I mean, there's lots of great Jewish songwriters. We talked about Lionel Barr. I mean, he's in the 60s, isn't he? But I mean, was this it? Was this the kind of was this the window closing now? In the sort of 50s, it was a particular moment in time that you've covered, and after that, it sort of went from the counterculture effectively into the culture.
I think that was always the aim, was to, in a way, change culture. and I think that whether you're Jewish, whether you're political, cultural, economic, whatever your kind of wherever you're coming from, your role, you feel, is to change things. And I think that that's what that community did want to change. They wanted to have a role in impacting on music and culture in this country. And I think you're right. I think it just becomes part of a much wider thing. And, obviously, we can go on and on about all the different sort of Jewish musicians, of course, and all the Jewish writers. But I think as well is that what happens is the world that this music inhabits is an era of what I would call still a ghetto. It's the ghetto of the East End or the ghetto of Soho, when people were living very close together, doing similar sort of jobs, going to the synagogue. And once that community disperses, and particularly that movement into suburbia of the Jewish culture, so for example, the Jewish schools in Soho start to close in the 30s and 40s. The synagogue held on till the early 90s. But certainly, and most of the clothing businesses went, although there are still some around. There are a few food places still left. There was obviously the kind of the Nosh bars, Phil Rabin's famous salt beef bar. But of course, once the community moves away, the kind of music that I'm talking about, the music that I'm intrigued about, which is a reflection of that world, the music isn't there anymore. Was that world isn't there kind of music anymore.
And that's why this is a good track to finish on, because it's Yiddisher samba. So you've got Yiddish music and samba, which is a South American thing.
Absolutely.
So it's hopped right the way across the Atlantic to South America.
Absolutely. When Max Bacon sung Beigels, it was a rumba. Back in the 1920s, there was a very famous song called the Yiddisher Charleston. So Stanley Loudon put out the Yiddisher samba, and Stanley Loudon was a character in his own right. Stanley was actually, unlike a lot of the East Enders, he was from Krakow, and he had fought with the Free Polish Army, ended up being injured at the Battle of Monte Cassino, found himself in Britain, and just played his way through life. He basically performed in bands, wrote songs, songwriter, publisher, manager, hustler, and had put out an album of just Yiddisher tracks in the 1950s, including this one, which is a classic. And in a way, it's the sort of embracing. It's no longer the jazz dance band. This is more, as we'll hear. This is very much
swinging 60s.
Yiddisher samba, the Yiddisher samba has rhythm and has life like the Spanish caramba. The Yiddisher samba is tasty like salad with syphilis and cucumber. Sister, brother, mother, and dad, you shouldn't miss that chance. A Rhein and Arroyos, be happy and glad, and dance that modern dance. The Yiddisher samba, sing loud and clap.
Thanks very much, Alan, for walking us through those beautiful tracks off the record.
Stephen, thank you very much. It's great. It's really good speaking with you about this, and I think I'd really like to think that the listener will enjoy the music in its own right, but obviously kind of pick up on those sort of connections, because what I love about so many things is it's all part of a bigger tapestry, isn't it? How we're all connected.
I think it's also part of what makes this city the way it is. For me, London is this kind of it always was geographically a collection of villages, wasn't it? And then it was a collection of communities of different ethnic races, and that's still going on in some ways, actually, isn't it? And that's why London is the way it is, and that's why we love it, actually, isn't it? And so to dig a bit deeper into some of those stories, and in this case, some of the music, it sort of just brings it all to life more, especially at a time when we've all been locked down, interestingly, of course, because you can still walk the streets of East London, you can still see some traces, some ghosted little bits left of it out there. So, Alan, thank you so much for providing us with that wonderful musical map to a lost world. And thanks for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Oh, it's a brilliant pleasure. Love it.
Do come back. Thanks a lot. Absolutely wonderful stuff. I'm going to put links to the album Music is the Most Beautiful Language in the World, Yiddisher Jazz in London's East End, 1920s to 1950s, released by JMW Records, plus the recent 7-inch single, if there's any of those left, and also links to Alan's other work, his wonderful radio show, Don't Log Off, and he's also an author of several social oral history books as well. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And I hope that you come back for more stories from the counterculture, stories of lost culture, rare audio from the other side. You can now check out this show as well as Soho Radio on all the major podcast providers. If you listen to it via Apple, we'd love you to leave a review. See you, hear you next time. I was Stephen Coates.